Ever since I started this channel, I've tried to be calm and dispassionate while looking at the modern complications we face. This is for a couple of reasons. First of all, I've noted in my own life that if something's making you emotional, that's fearful or angry, normally someone wants to manipulate you into their own political narratives. Secondly, at a time where things can boil over and bleed out into the streets in modern Britain, I think it's worth trying to cool the temperature a little bit. I've never promoted any form of violence. I don't even promote rudeness. However, we do have to be able to talk about the situations that our country faces in an objective manner. Simply ignoring them is only going to make things worse. This is why I was somewhat alarmed when somebody drew my attention to the government's definition of what they term extreme right-wing terrorist ideology. The following is an intro to a course the government have created on spotting such ideology. Apparently, extreme right-wing terrorist ideology involves beliefs that support the use of violence to protect or preserve a race, identity, culture or country from what is perceived as a serious and immediate threat to their existence. Now, if I was to be charitable, I'd say I get what they're trying to say here, basically radical right-wing groups that are prepared to use violence to further their aims. If I was to be cynical, though, I'd point out that this all comes down to how we perceive perception itself. Herein lies the implicit suggestion that if you have a belief that Western culture is under threat via mass immigration, you're an extreme right-wing terrorist. Further, there's an odd twist in the definition here. It states that extreme right-wing terrorism is defending a race, identity, culture and country from attack and so on. However, that's what many liberal heroes did, like Nelson Mandela, for instance. Is he a far-right extreme terrorist now? But maybe I'm being too cynical. Maybe there is a serious problem with right-wing terrorism and potential violence, and that does have to be dealt with. However, the more I read on, the more I think something else is going on here. The course continues. The three most common subcategories of extreme right-wing terrorist ideologies and their narratives are, firstly, cultural nationalism, the idea that Western culture, in quote marks, is under threat from mass migration and a lack of integration by certain ethnic and cultural groups. Now, they're dressing this up to make it look like anybody who's concerned by mass immigration is crazy. However, let's do a quick hypothetical. If the population of Brazil moved into Japan tomorrow, would Japanese culture still be just as Japanese? You could say that diversity is a strength and mass immigration into Japan is absolutely wonderful and amazing, but that doesn't change the question. Has Japanese culture been diluted? Of course it has. I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing, but it definitely has happened. So firstly, that's not a political point, that's an apolitical point that's neither left nor right, it's just a fact of life. Second to that, if the Japanese said afterwards, do you know what, we didn't actually want the population of Brazil to move here, would they be sympathetic to extreme right-wing terrorism? That would seem to be absurd to me, but it seems to me that what's going on here is something we see a lot in the modern liberal world. Of course, if you have actual far-right violent groups planning an attack, you have to act on those people. However, they're doing that classic liberal trick of including anybody who thinks outside of the liberal system, anybody who's concerned by mass migration, as somehow evil, potentially violent, even a terrorist. They do the same trick when they speak of white/ethno-nationalism. They state mass migration from the non-white world and demographic change poses an existential threat to the white race and Western culture. Now, the language there has that 1930s fascist German flavour. However, what about if you're not an ethno-nationalist or a white nationalist and have simply noted that in London, white Brits now make up about a third of the population, that by 2070, white Brits will be a minority in Britain itself? Would such a person be a far-right extremist terrorist? After all, if he was, then that means you're calling more than half the country that, because every time we've had an election, I've got to have a say on mass immigration, the people have said they don't want it. And again, people don't think that way because they're full of hatred and anger of other people. They do it because they're concerned about their country and they'd like it to maintain its traditional character. But again, it's all in the framing. Liberals talk like this to make it seem like they're just concerned about a very extreme faction, but the implicit assumption is anybody who's concerned about any of these things is evil and far-right and shouldn't be trusted. But this is how the liberal regime furthers its agenda. The bit that it's not mentioning is that essentially it wants to create a world where it's mandatory to be pro-mass immigration, to be pro-diversity. Again, I'm not saying this because I hate other people. Many of us believe what we do because we believe that worldview leads to the best results when it comes to social harmony and the public good for all people, not just those in the UK. But we're going to have to watch language like this very carefully, because it seems to me that anything outside of the liberal worldview is going to get increasingly demonised. These are just my thoughts, however, do let me know what you think down below. Do consider subscribing to the channel.